When Star Wars: A New Hope released in 1977, a franchise was born. Star Wars took the world by storm and became an instant blockbuster, and 50 years later, it's still going strong. Like with any great franchise, Star Wars didn't just stop at films. In no time at all, the franchise had spawned a long list of video games that have captured the hearts and imagination of millions of people. Some good, some bad, and some downright strange. As you can probably tell by some of our other videos, we here at Geetsly are huge fans of many Star Wars games. For every KOTOR 2 and Star Wars Battlefront, however, there are a dozen oft-forgotten games that still deserve to be remembered and appreciated for all they did for the franchise, whether that was creating a masterpiece or just fun content. In this series, we'll be exploring the history of Star Wars games from the very beginning, doing our best to highlight each game, their plot, and what they did well or badly. In this first video of the series, we'll be starting with the weird and wacky world of vintage Star Wars games released in the 1980s and 1990s. Some you'll be very familiar with, and some we'd bet our editor you've never even heard of before. So buckle up and let's dive right in. Following the success of The Empire Strikes Back, a toy and game manufacturer later acquired by Hasbro released the very first Star Wars video games between 1982 and 1983, all for the Atari 2600, and it all started with Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. This side-scrolling shooter game did its best to recapture the Battle of Hoth despite having all of 20 pixels. Players played as an Alliance speeder pilot defending Echo Base from a wave of incoming AT-ATs. While the game itself was fairly simple, and all players had to do was not die, destroy the enemies, and not let them reach the end of the map, it had customizable difficulty settings that allowed players to make it more of a challenge. It might not be the prettiest or most in-depth game by today's standards, but this was the first time Star Wars had ever been adapted into a video game, so we have to credit it for being the pioneer that eventually brought us where we are today. There's a reason it's still remembered fondly. For all it's done, we have to give it a 7 out of 10, would defend Echo Base again. The following year, Parker Brothers followed it up with Star Wars: Return of the Jedi, Death Star Battle, which was also a hit, this time recreating the Battle of Yavin. In this pixel shooter, players piloted an Alliance starfighter trying to destroy the Death Star. The game had two phases. In the first, players had to destroy enemy fighters while waiting for an opportunity to slip past the energy shield, and in the second, they had to destroy the Death Star pixel by pixel, all while avoiding enemy fighters, the Death Star's laser beam, and the additional pixels sneakily trying to complete the Death Star so it can end the game. Once players succeeded in detonating the thermal port, the game looped back to the start. Despite the sometimes janky controls, this was an excellent game for its time, and we can just imagine kids across the world bragging about their high scores to their friends. For sheer rebel shenanigans, we'd have to give this a 7.5 out of 10. Pixels are trying to hurt me. The final game in this trilogy came out that same year. Star Wars Jedi Arena was a more PvP-oriented game that let players play with their friends. In the game, two players faced off against each other in an arena, defended by a pixelated shield and armed with a lightsaber. In the center of the arena, a Seeker orb floated around, shooting lasers. Players had to use their lightsabers to block the orb's attacks and defend their shields while also directing the orb's attacks to their opponent's shield. Sometimes the orb would go nuts and fire randomly, which added to the chaos of the game. Once a player's shield was breached and they had taken a direct hit, their opponent earned a point, and the game would end once a player had gotten 3 points. Despite the extremely glitchy controls at times, especially on a replay, this game could easily be remade today and become super popular. For that, we'd give it an 8 out of 10. Epileptics, beware. It didn't take long for Star Wars to be adapted into arcade games, which were extremely popular back then. The film's action sequences were perfect for an arcade game, which is probably why so many of them were released. In May of 1983, we got the first ever Star Wars arcade game known simply as Star Wars. This game used beautiful colors and vectors to recreate the Battle of Yavin. Playing as Luke, Players start off by taking down enemy TIE fighters on the way to the Death Star. Once there, they have to navigate the Death Star surface defenses, destroying towers and dodging obstacles and blaster bolts. The final level has the player dodging obstacles and turrets while doing the trench run until, at the end, they detonate the Death Star before the game loops from the beginning. Despite being so simple, we think the game is absolutely beautiful even by today's standards, and the music and nostalgia combination make this one of the better games on our list. For that, it gets a 9 out of 10. Bring back Vector Games. 2 years later, we got a follow-up game in the form of Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. This new Vector arcade game told the story of the Battle of Hoth, split into levels like its predecessor. The first level has the player, Luke Skywalker, destroying probe droids that are sending coordinate transmissions to the Empire. The second level has you go up against AT-ATs and AT-STs on their way to Echo Base, and in the final level, you swap to Han Solo in the Millennium Falcon, blasting your way past TIE fighters and asteroids to escape Hoth. Just like Star Wars, this game is beautiful for what it is, poses a great and fun challenge to players, and has some pretty kick-ass music to boot. Another 9 out of 10. Neon never looked so good. Similar to the 1983 arcade game was Star Wars Arcade, published in 1994 by Sega. This arcade game was a space simulator in which two players could play as rebel pilots battling the forces of the Empire. The game had 3 levels. On the first, players intercepted TIE fighters on an asteroid field. In the second, they destroyed a Super Star Destroyer, and on the third, they assaulted the Death Star. Despite a seemingly disappointing launch for the Sega 32X, the game had amazing graphics that drew people in, and enough difficulty to keep players trying. Overall, it's remembered very fondly, so we'll give it an 8 out of 10. Lasers go brr. 4 years later, Sega also gave us Star Wars Trilogy Arcade, a rail shooter that fans remember fondly. The game was a simple point-and-click shooter with cutscenes you could trigger after certain points. In total, there were 3 missions, one for each movie, with 3 parts to each one. For Episode 5, we got the Battle of Yavin, with an approach to the Death Star, a run along its surface, and finally, the trench run. For Episode 5, we got the Battle of Hoth, shooting down incoming walkers on a snowspeeder, escaping Hoth on the Millennium Falcon, and dispatching enemies in the hangar back in Echo Base. Finally, for Episode 6, we got the Battle of Endor, with a speeder chase planet-side, infiltrating the Empire's base and destroying a walker. Once all 3 missions had been completed, the player unlocked a secret final level where, as Wedge Antilles, they got to blow up the second Death Star. Although all of these missions were simple rehashes of the movies, Star Wars Trilogy Arcade did them well, with fun gameplay and fantastic attention to detail in all the character and level designs. For that, we'll give it a solid 8 out of 10. More content than we're used to. Meanwhile, in Japan, Namco released 2 Star Wars games for the Famicom that the West didn't see for a long time. The first, released in 1987, was just known as Star Wars. In this side-scroll platformer, players had to guide Luke across multiple levels, using his lightsaber and force powers to unlock areas, defeat enemies, and bosses. Throughout the game, players had to take down many of Darth Vader's apprentices, fight Vader himself, and use the Millennium Falcon to clear the way to the next planet. On the final level, you had to fly an X-Wing to destroy the Death Star. At the time, it was an extremely difficult game with challenging progression and only 3 lives. Players could use the Force to secure 2 continues, but many runs still ended in a game over. For the challenge and its story, we'll give it a 7 out of 10. Try not to rage quit. The second, Star Wars Attack on the Death Star, didn't come out until 1991. After a short intro video to set up the game, the player set off on a wireframe adventure to destroy the Death Star. After destroying several TIEs on the way to the Death Star, the player's X-Wing skated along its surface, destroying the turrets before finally diving into the trench and destroying the battle station. What's truly amazing about this game is that, despite using simple wireframing and colored lines, the intro video and gameplay had a real sense of motion and depth that felt magical, especially for the limitations of the system. For that, we'll give it an 8 out of 10. Please remake in VR. After the success Star Wars saw on the Atari, many other game developers brought the franchise to home consoles. In 1988, Mastertronic published a game known simply as Star Wars Droids. Based on the 1985 animated series, this arcade-style platformer followed the adventures of C-3PO and R2-D2 as they escaped from the From Gang, making their way through multiple levels to reunite with their master. The gameplay itself was fine, with several puzzle elements and easy obstacles. However, this game committed a sin we can never forgive. The controls were all icon-based and located on the bottom third of a split-screen setup. To perform any task, players had to navigate to the right icon and select it. Yes, even to move left and right. Just for this infuriating choice, we'll give this game a 2 out of 10. What were they thinking? In 1991, yet another game, just titled Star Wars, was released for the Famicom in Japan and the NES in the rest of the world. This action platformer started the player off on Tatooine, where Luke Skywalker had to navigate several levels to collect R2-D2, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Han Solo, all while dodging enemies. From there, players had to fly the Millennium Falcon through an asteroid field until they reached the Death Star, where they had to rescue Princess Leia and destroy the battle station. This is perhaps the first story-driven video game we've seen, with dialogue options and even party members with different skills that can be swapped out. In that sense, the game was revolutionary, moving from more action arcade to RPG, and the gameplay is varied and fun. We'll give it a venerable 7 out of 10. Grandpa had the right idea. A few years later, in 1996, Star Wars Shadows of the Empire was released for the N64. This third-person shooter game saw players controlling Dash Rendar, a mercenary, as he helped Luke Skywalker across the galaxy on various missions until they finally saved Princess Leia from Prince Zyzor. Although the game was a typical shooter, it featured other non-shooter elements, like the snowspeeder piloting of the first level that was so good it inspired future Star Wars games to always include a level on Hoth. It also introduced 360-degree space battles. Although there were some minor issues with the controls, the game is beautiful and the story is so incredibly immersive it almost feels like you're standing right behind Dash. It earned itself a solid 8 out of 10. Wish modern games gave us this much content. A year later in 1997, LucasArts changed things up yet again by not only releasing the first ever Star Wars fighting game, but also its first ever title for the PlayStation. Star Wars Masters of Teras Kasi was set during episodes 5 and 6. As the plot goes, Emperor Palpatine, enraged by the rebel victories, hired Arden Lin, an assassin, to assassinate the Alliance leadership. When Luke and the others discovered the plot, they challenged Arden to a Teras Kasi duel, aka unarmed hand-to-hand combat, giving the game the excuse to exist. Gameplay-wise, players fought in timed matches, and to win the match, a player had to win 2 out of 3 rounds. Most characters could fight both armed and unarmed, unlocking special moves by filling up a meter as the game progresses. That said, this is the game most people try to forget. The gameplay is boring and repetitive, and the unarmed strikes, the entire premise of the game, are pointless when the enemy just pulls out a pistol and shoots you across the map. 3 out of 10. R2 didn't. Directly inspired by Star Wars Shadows of the Empire's success, Star Wars Rogue Squadron was released a year later. The game loosely followed the exploits of Luke Skywalker and Wedge Antilles after the Battle of Yavin, but the real plot was just an excuse to put players in starfighters and have them shoot things. The gameplay was built around quick, arcade-style missions where players zipped across deserts, snowfields, and shady backwater planets while taking on everything from TIE swarms to massive walkers. Alongside the game's main 16 levels, players could also unlock 3 bonus levels, all of which could be replayed. For its time, it was a beautiful game, and the sense of speed and cinematics were some of the reasons this is one of the most beloved Star Wars games of its era. For everything it delivered, this one earns a 9 out of 10. Would absolutely go rogue again. Between 1992 and 1994, a trilogy of games for the SNES were released that had similar, exciting gameplay. The first was Super Star Wars, a run-and-gun platformer that followed the story of A New Hope. While the story and characterization were pretty well done, the main complaint about this game was the difficulty. Super Star Wars was brutally hard, with rapid-fire respawning enemies that moved faster than your character could react to, awkward angles even from the first level, and blind drops. Some of the later levels were more streamlined, but for the unnecessarily brutal start, we'll give this game a 4 out of 10. Get good or go home. The sequel, Super Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, came out the following year, and it built on the first game and improved it dramatically. Following the story of Episode 5, characters now received both a primary and secondary weapon, the controls felt smoother, and players got the ability to block enemy fire. The first level was still brutally difficult, but the entire game felt more manageable overall, and that difficulty was mitigated by being able to ride a Tauntaun that gave you extra health. For these improvements, we'll give the game a 5.5 out of 10, getting there slowly. The final game in this series was Super Star Wars: Return of the Jedi, which is by far the best of the three. The game looked beautiful, with stunning lighting effects and scenery. Though it also had an awkward first level, the rest of the platform levels felt doable, and it kept all the quality of life upgrades from the second game. More importantly, you could play as Slave Leia and use a whip to destroy your enemies. So this game gets an automatic 6.9 out of 10. Nice. As computers became more and more common in homes around the world and CDs became more widespread, many Star Wars games were published for the PC. In 1993, Star Wars Rebel Assault became the very first Star Wars game to be CD only. This was a rail shooter that included CGI rendered scenes from the original movies and even real speech and high-end music design. In the game, you played as a rebel pilot during episodes 5 and 6, undertaking operations and clearing stages. The game itself looked great for its time, but it suffered on two fronts. The first was that, in trying to be too much like the movies, it didn't do a great job of being a standalone game, and the second was that it didn't handle very well for a rail shooter. Still, we have to give it a 6 out of 10, a pioneer in its field. This game got a sequel known as Star Wars Rebel Assault 2, The Hidden Empire, that improved on many of the original's flaws. Controls handled a lot better, and the devs added a dodge mechanic that let players dodge enemy fire. The game graphics also received a significant upgrade. More importantly, however, this game didn't try to recreate the movies anymore. It had an original, totally not the movie storyline, with improved and more varied gameplay, which makes it a truly nostalgic game to come back to. Solid 8 out of 10. Nerd approved. On the opposite end of this spectrum is Star Wars Chess, another 1993 game that was straight up chess for the PC. The game replaced the onboard chess pieces with characters from the movies, and when a piece was taken, it played a small animated battle. It's a cute game that brought chess to many people in the early 90s, so we'll give it a sweet 6 out of 10. We stan Queen Vader. Equally weird was Monopoly Star Wars, a video game adaptation of the OG board game published by Hasbro in 1997. The video game played exactly like the board game, but with themed pieces that had cool animations. The game could handle up to 4 players, with AI options available for when you had fewer or wanted to play alone. Despite the 3D graphics slowing down the gameplay a fair bit, we won't go too hard on the game. It's already a Monopoly game, so it's up for a rough enough score as it is. We'll give it a 3.5 out of 10. This game destroyed families. 1997 also brought us Star Wars Yoda Stories, a short and sweet adventure point-and-click game. Each new game created procedurally generated 2D maps where players guided Luke Skywalker into completing procedurally generated missions, whether that was rescuing another character, defeating an enemy, and so on. Players had to maneuver Luke across the map, collecting weapons and supplies, pulling and pushing objects, and generally using their tools and environment to complete all the puzzles on the level. Each level was designed to last players about an hour. Despite how simple it was extremely entertaining, and the randomness of each map was quite novel at the time. For how sweet of a game it is, we'd give it a 7.5 out of 10. Star Wars Solitaire. Star Wars Rebellion, meanwhile, was a 1998 RTS game where the player was in charge of commanding either Alliance or Imperial forces against the opposite faction. Both options came with a series of pros and cons, with such complicated strategy that playing it required heavy use of its companion manual. This may have contributed to why the game flopped so badly, earning itself the most disappointing Game of the Year award by GameSpot. 2 out of 10. Ain't got time to read that much. 1999 also brought us Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, an action-adventure game that pretty much closely followed the plot of the movie. Controlling either Obi-Wan Kenobi, Qui-Gon Jinn, Queen Amidala, or Captain Panaka, the player had to navigate the levels to complete the story. The two Jedi characters used their lightsaber and the Force on top of the blasters, explosives, and missile launchers the other two got. Interacting with NPCs helped progress the story, but also offered the player vendors, hints, and even side quests. At various points of the game, Darth Maul made an appearance, as did other enemies like battle droids, AATs, and Tusken Raiders. The game was among the first 3D Star Wars games to feature lightsaber duels as a combat feature. That said, the game struggled on multiple fronts. While the storyline it was trying to accomplish was fairly complex for a game of its time, the gameplay itself fell short. The lightsaber duels were shallow and frustrating, more like swinging a basketball bat than a lightsaber, and the many genres it tried to hit competed too much with one another. Overall though, it was an extremely bold choice for its time, and still managed to hit many high notes, which is why it's regarded well today. We'll give it a 7 out of 10. Swing that light bat. And finally, the first ever racing game. It's quite surprising that it took until 1999 for us to get a dedicated Star Wars racer, given how much pod racing featured in the first movie, but 1999 gave us Star Wars Episode 1, Racer. A game so popular, it got a re-release 20 years later for the Nintendo Switch. This racing game was released for consoles on both the N64 and Dreamcast, and for the PC, this racing game was released for consoles on both the N64 and Dreamcast and for the PC, and featured a variety of tracks on multiple planets, including all the known races in the film and exclusive competitors. Players could use their pod racer's afterburner for a burst of speed that reminds us of the Nitro from Need for Speed, though they had to manage their engine's temperature or risk it exploding. When a player's pod exploded, whether from overheating or just slamming into things, they took several seconds to respawn and continue, so it wasn't game over, but it did set you back in the race quite a bit. Players also had the option to repair the speeder as they went, but that slowed them down while repairs lasted. The game came with both a single player and multiplayer mode. In single player, players could participate in a championship that paid out for every race, letting them buy new parts to upgrade or repair their pod racer, unlock new tracks and races, free race mode where players could freely practice previous tracks, and time attack, where they had to achieve the best time possible. Multiplayer was also different between the PC and console versions. Consoles had a split-screen setup, whereas PCs allowed for LAN connections for up to 8 players. Just for being the very first racing game, and for all the variety it offered, we have to give this game an 8.5 out of 10. Eat our pod dust. Perhaps surprisingly, there were a fair number of Star Wars games released for edutainment purposes around the turn of the century, mostly geared toward young children. As such, these aren't really games easily appreciated by older audiences, but they had a certain charm to them, and many even had unique and interesting premises. Given their target audience and purpose, we've relaxed our very serious rating system for this specific section. In 1998, Lucas Learning published an edutainment game known as Star Wars Droidworks, an educational game aimed at teaching kids about concepts such as energy, force, motion, simple machines, light, and magnetism. The premise was fairly simple. C-3PO and R2-D2 were sent to Tatooine to shut down production at an Imperial droid factory. To complete the game's missions, players had to build droids with specific abilities, like seeing in the dark or jumping. With 87 parts to choose from, there were millions of combinations that players could create, and even paint in the Jawa Droid workshop. Overall, it's a cute game for what it did, so we'll give it a 3 out of 5 beat bops. A year later, we got Star Wars Pit Droids, an educational puzzle game. In the game, players had to transport Watto's new pit droids to the pod racing arena, navigating through a series of puzzles and environmental obstacles like roadblocks and junk heaps. One nice detail is that players could make their own puzzles. Short, sweet, and fairly unimpressive. 2.5 out of 5. DroidWorks was better. That same year brought Star Wars Yoda's Challenge Activity Center, another fun little educational game. In it, you played as a promising Force-sensitive child brought to Yoda after the Battle of Naboo, and your goal was to help him with his various tasks to make the galaxy a better place. The game had 6 levels with 4 difficulties each, and involved activities like exploring the Gungan caves to find 4 ancient relics, or making a songbook for Anakin to help him remember Tatooine. Other levels were more practical, like reprogramming Padme's computer or retrieving battle droids still trapped on Naboo. Overall, it was a cute idea, but it didn't even offer much educational potential for what it was trying to do, so we'll give it a 2 out of 5. DroidWorks, still better. Now, we know this one wasn't strictly educational, but we've included this here to avoid the lynching. In 1999, Star Wars Jar Jar's Journey was released. This was an interactive storybook for children ages 4 and up that wasn't so much a game as much as it was an animated book with only 14 pages guiding kids through the story of Episode 1. The book helped young kids with their reading and introduced them to Star Wars, sure, but it also heavily featured Jar Jar, so we'll have to give it a 1.5 out of 5. Misa, no likey. A far more unique game was Star Wars Episode 1, The Gungan Frontier, a life simulation educational game that handled similar to SimLife. The player was tasked with introducing organisms to Omar Dun, the moon of Naboo, in order to develop a stable ecosystem that could support Gungan colonization. To do this, they had to use the Kresh, a sacred creature they received from Boss Nass. The game's goal was to teach young gamers about ecology, biodiversity, and biology, which were all very interesting choices. Sweet and harmless, we'll give this one a 3 out of 5. Rehoming Jar Jar. Also pretty unique was Star Wars Anakin Speedway, a game released in 2000 for children ages 4 and up. The game featured a young Anakin Skywalker and other characters from Episode 1 in a puzzle construction simulator. Players had to construct, then master pod racing test tracks using loops, jumps, turns, and tunnels to design complex pathways. The intent of the game was to teach children about speed and momentum, like when a speeder has to make a jump and carry itself forward. It was a cute idea, which we know we're saying a lot in this segment, but they're games for toddlers. A racing game was a fun choice, and we're sure many young children enjoyed it at the time. 4 out of 5. We designed a death loop. Another game saga that is, to this day, one of the most beloved series in the franchise is the Dark Forces trilogy, a trio of first-person shooters that somehow captured the magic of Star Wars better than most modern games. Starting with Star Wars Dark Forces in 1995, the first-person shooter game saw players guide Kyle Katarn, an ex-Imperial turned Rebel operative, through a series of missions to infiltrate Imperial bases, to gather intelligence, or perform sabotage. After stealing the Death Star plans, Katarn stumbled upon something known as the Dark Trooper Project, an Imperial initiative to create superpowered stormtroopers. Gameplay-wise, Dark Forces played out like a typical FPS of its time, with multiple weapons players could cycle through to mow down their opponents. Unlike other Doom copycats of the era, however, Dark Forces went out of its way to make itself more than just a mindless shooter. The story and missions were intriguing, with cutscenes that added to the hype and maps that tried to pose a challenge. The layout of many levels was designed to be maze-like while incorporating puzzle elements, such as key items to collect in order to progress, doors to open, and so on. All in all, this is a fantastic game, and though some of the controls are a little off on modern consoles, it still holds up as a fan-favorite game for good reason. For everything it dared to do, this one gets an 8.5 out of 10. would absolutely steal the Death Star plans again. In 1997, the game got a sequel, Star Wars Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, that picked up the story in 5 ABY, 4 years after the first game's ending. The game began with Kyle investigating his father's recent death, only to discover that he'd been murdered by a Dark Jedi known as Jarek. Along with several other Dark Jedi, Jarek meant to reform the Galactic Empire and was looking for a location known as the Valley of the Jedi. It was up to Kyle to stop them, armed with the Force and a lightsaber at his father's behest. What really sold the story of this game were the cutscenes in between missions. Sure, they could get a bit lengthy, but they were fully voiced and used a combination of real actors and green screens to make the game feel truly alive. Gameplay-wise, Dark Forces was another shooter that swapped from first to third person once you got your lightsaber. The maps were even more detailed with added verticality, and the use of force powers made it even more interesting. A great choice the devs added was a light or dark side choice further down the game, which determined the ending and affected what additional force powers Kyle could unlock, and by extension, the playstyle. Overall, the sequel truly did the original proud, so we'll give it an 8.5 out of 10. Time to off some Dark Jedi. The final installment came out 1 year later in 1998. Star Wars Jedi Knight Mysteries of the Sith picked up in 10 ABY, 5 years after the second game, and happened to land during the events of the Dark Empire comic series. The story continued from the light side choices Kyle made at the ending of the second game. Players were also introduced to Kyle's apprentice, Mara Jade, whom he was training at the start of the game. After a training session on Altair 5 was interrupted by an Imperial attack, Master and Apprentice were separated, leaving players to control Mara Jade for the remainder of the game. With Kyle off to investigate a Sith temple on Dromund Kaas, Mara Jade was left to complete missions for the New Republic. When contact was lost with her master, she traveled to Dromund Kaas only to find him fallen to the dark side. The two dueled, and in the end, Kyle was able to return to the light, though the experience scarred him enough that he renounced the Force and returned to his mercenary ways. This game added many new improved features like colored lighting, better textures, models, and AI, and even an 8-player multiplayer option. That said, the game could be extremely frustrating, with tiny openings to search for on large maps that made exploration and progression feel like a massive chore, made worse by how dark the levels were to encourage players to use Force vision. Overall, it was a good game, but a disappointing ending to Kyle's story, so we'll give it a 5 out of 10. We got the bad ending. Around this time, perhaps the most beloved vintage Star Wars game series came out. A series that not only did great things for the expanded universe, but also fulfilled many fans' dreams of feeling like they were really in the universe. All 4 games were space combat simulators and had similar gameplay, with upgrades as technology progressed. Star Wars X-Wing was the first game in this series. Published in 1993, the game followed a nameless rebel pilot as he completed his tour of duty. All missions were first-person POV, flying starfighters that required the player to balance laser power, shields, and other controls while destroying enemy fighters and asteroids. There was a wide variety of operations to undertake, such as rescue missions and attack runs. The overall experience was made even better by the game's fully realized 3D engine, which made space feel huge and filled with objects moving in real time. Missions were challenging but fun, and for many, this was the start of the greatest Star Wars game series that has ever been released. Nostalgia goggles aside, we'll give it an 8 out of 10. Really feels like Star Wars. X-Wing's sequel, Star Wars TIE Fighter, came out a year later. This time, the game followed an Imperial TIE pilot running missions for the Empire sometime after the Battle of Hoth. Mission targeted enemies like rebel pilots, pirates, and even some Imperial traders. The base game ended with the player preventing a coup against the Emperor and getting rewarded for it, but later expansions focused on Grand Admiral Thrawn's efforts to stop an Imperial traitor. TIE Fighter didn't change much in regards to gameplay other than adding a third-person shooter mode, but it's still considered one of the best games simply for what it did for Star Wars. Together with the heir to the Empire novels, TIE Fighter helped establish the expanded universe as we know it today, making the universe feel much bigger and allowing for stories to coexist with the movies. Just for that, we have to give this legend a 9 out of 10. Hello, Thrawn. 2 years later, after that, came the third installment to the series, Star Wars X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter. Although this game brought many revolutionary technologies into the Star Wars video game scene, like high-res graphics and texture mapping, the game was an overall flop. In place of a main storyline, the game was designed as a multiplayer game where up to 8 people could play together in a co-op team, or team missions, or free-for-all space battles. Although the gameplay was fun and built well of its predecessor's work, the lack of story earns it a measly 1 out of 10. We wish it was single player. The LucasArts redeemed themselves 3 years later in 1999 with the final installment of this series, Star Wars X-Wing Alliance. For many gamers, this is the best Star Wars game published in the previous century. The game followed Ace, a rebel pilot flying missions for his family and the Rebel Alliance, even participating in the Battle of Endor. Just like its predecessors had done, Alliance upgraded the gameplay experience with things like full voiceover, in-flight dialogue, rudder support, added weapon options, and even the ability to cycle crewmates on multi-crew ships. The best part, however, was how the game cemented its connection to the expanded universe storyline, making for a fantastic experience that wasn't yet another movie recreation. For this, we'll keep our rose-tinted glasses firmly on and give it a 9.5 out of 10. We wish they still made games this good. We really hope you enjoyed going on this nostalgia trip with us to see the good, the bad, and the wacky of these vintage Star Wars games. For many fans, these games were the reason they got so invested into the franchise and stayed excited until the prequel trilogy launched, bringing in a new era of games. In the next video of this series, we'll be talking about the golden age of Star Wars games, so make sure you stay tuned. Did you play any of these games at release, or even later through emulators? Which are your favorites? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.